Hi there, I'm board-certified dermatologist and skin wellness expert, Dr. Cynthia Bailey, and today I'm going to talk about sunscreens. What sunscreen is the best? Are you confused about which sunscreen to use? Have you heard that sunscreens are ending up in mother's milk, that they can cause hormone disruption and downstream ramifications from that? Have you used products that sting your skin? Have you used products that fail to protect your skin and you end up with a sunburn even though you've done everything you know you're supposed to do? Have you heard that the FDA is to blame and people in Europe get better sunscreens than we do and it's all not fair? So where's the truth? What do you believe? What works? What doesn't? And what's going on? I'm going to explain all of that and give you my opinion because honestly, the science is not entirely settled. In all of the controversy that you've heard about sunscreens, there's truth and there's misinformation. There's exaggeration, there's over-exaggeration, and there's industry interest because there are patents and there's money to be made. So the whole topic of sunscreens is difficult to sort out. I've been a scientist for 40 years and a dermatologist for 30, and I'm going to be 60, so all of that's a little bit mind-boggling to me. But in all that time, as a scientist and a dermatologist, I've watched the scientific evolution of sun protection, both why we need to protect our skin from the sun and wear sunscreen, and what happens if we don't, and which sun filters are best. And so I'm going to give you my assessment, my opinion, and my observation from being privileged to watch patients for 30 years as they go out and test different products and come back and bring me the results on their skin exam. So there are two basic types of sunscreen, and the names are confusing. One is the organic sunscreens, and they're organic because they're not mineral. They have a more complicated carbon-based structure, and so they are termed organic. Unfortunately, organic implies in the marketplace that things were grown and created in natural conditions. Don't even think about that when it comes to sunscreens. The word organic means a chemical-based sun filter or UV filter. The other group of sunscreens are physical sunscreens. They're also called mineral sunscreens, and that's because they're based on the minerals, either titanium dioxide or zinc oxide. They are physical particles that are used as UV filters. And what's important in both the organic and the physical filters is that the formulations are tricky, testing of UV protection is tricky, and looking at isolated scientific articles without taking all of that into context can lead one to erroneous conclusions. So when it comes to formulations of sunscreens, what filters are used together in the bottle of a product or in the formula of a product is important because filters can block predictably by themselves, but when you mix them together, they can inactivate each other. In addition, particle size is important, especially with the physical sunscreens. The particle size and also the particle coating around the particles are important to how that physical particle blocks ultraviolet radiation. So one zinc oxide isn't the same as another zinc oxide if the particle size is different or it's coated with something different. In addition, how the protection is assessed is important. It can be assessed in a test tube. It can be assessed on a piece of tissue that's been cut off of something that's living, or it can be assessed actually on a living human or animal. So in vitro is in the test tube, ex vivo is on a piece of tissue that's been cut out, and in vivo is in real life. It's important that the tests, in my opinion, are done in vivo because the skin is very dynamic, and how the sunscreen is absorbed or where it sits in the skin is important to the protection that you get from the product. Adding to the confusion around sunscreens is that there's not an international consensus on how to test and rate products. And it's not because of any malintent. Everybody does want to get this right. It's that the topic is so complicated. And so Europe does it one way, Japan does it another way, Australia does it another way, the United States FDA does it another way. They're all trying, but it's complicated. In addition, some countries are using in vitro testing for UVA, and some countries requiring in vivo testing of UVA. UVA is the most difficult wavelength for us to understand. It's also the most difficult wavelength to block using UV filters, meaning the active ingredients in sunscreen. So in my opinion, the FDA is not the bad guy. They're doing a good job. They've required in vivo testing of UVA photoprotection, which I think is really important. And they're also requiring photostability testing, which is also very important. You want to know that that formula is holding up both in the bottle and on your skin when UV is shining on your skin. You don't want to be using a product that's promptly inactivated when UV exposure occurs. In addition, the FDA has good criteria for water resistance. So it's no longer allowed to claim that a product is waterproof. We now have to use the word water resistance, and that water resistance is measured by, does it hold up when you're immersed in the water for 40 minutes or 80 minutes? And in the United States, the FDA is requiring companies to prove that the SPF is equivalent before one goes in the water and after one comes out of the water. In other countries, a product can claim water resistance even if the SPF is diminished by 50%. I'm not a big fan of that. I prefer the FDA's approach to water resistance. So you need to understand that sunscreens were initially developed to prevent sunburn, and that's what the SPF actually meant. Sunscreens and the concept of the SPF started way back in 1956, so this is not brand new, but they have evolved significantly and continuously since that time. Heck, when I was a kid, it was Ski and Coppertone, which had an SPF of 4, blocking only the sunburn ray with a very minute amount of protection provided. And that's what I grew up on. To understand ultraviolet exposure, you need to understand what UVB and UVA means, and you need to understand the difference between UVA1 and UVA2. So ultraviolet rays are wavelengths of light. Light is a wavelength, and the wavelength is defined as the peak between the waves as they're wiggling their way towards you. And UVB has shorter wavelengths. UVA2, the wavelengths are starting to get a little longer. UVA1, they're a little longer. So UVB is defined as a wavelength of 290 to 320 nanometers. UVA2 is defined as 320 to 340. Importantly, most of the sunburn that you get comes from UVB, but some redness to the skin also comes from UVA2. UVA1 is the holy grail. It's defined as between 340 and 400 nanometers. And what's important about these wavelengths, and why I'm even bringing them up, is the wavelength determines the degree of penetration into the skin. So the shorter wavelength UVB disperses most of its energy up in the epidermis. UVA can penetrate more deeply down into the dermis. Where the wavelengths penetrate and transfer their energy to the structures in the skin that absorb energy, that determines where the damage is done. So with UVB, most of the misadventure's happening up in the epidermis. With UVA, the misadventure can go down deeper into the dermis, and that's important for photoaging as well as for skin cancer. Within this spectrum of wavelengths, what we do know is that science isn't perfect. We have a really hard time blocking the very last bit of UVA1. And even my beloved zinc oxide starts to drop off on protection as it hits the very last bit of UVA1. What we do know is that the daily use of sunscreen does help protect skin from skin cancer and help protect skin from the degradative effects of ultraviolet exposure that lead to photoaging, including thinning of the dermis, loss of collagen structure in the dermis, and thinning of the epidermis. So what are the consequences of ultraviolet light shining on the skin and transferring energy to skin structures? We know that when the energy is transferred down into the dermis and damages the fibroblasts, which are our cells that produce our collagen, the fibroblasts now produce defective collagen, and elastotic material that you see through the skin as a sort of a lumpy, clumpy, odd yellow color. We also know that damaged fibroblasts interact with the keratinocytes in the epidermis and weaken the barrier at the dermal-epidermal junction. And that also translates into photoaging skin. That same UV energy transfer activates an enzyme called MMP. There are a number of MMP enzymes, and they, when expressed, break down collagen, so you lose collagen that's already there, and they prevent the formation of new good collagen. That leads to wrinkled and crepey skin. That same ultraviolet energy transfer into the structures of the skin cause damage to a tumor suppression gene called P53, and so any mutations that form in the DNA of the keratinocytes or the melanocytes are not cleaned up as well by the body's damage repair mechanisms because the tumor suppressor gene isn't functioning properly. In addition, Langerhans cells, which are important sort of cleanup cells in the skin, are suppressed from ultraviolet exposure into the skin. What's really important to know is that the consequences of ultraviolet damage in the skin accumulate. So wearing sunscreen most of the time, but forgetting it occasionally, will actually lead to the accumulation of the adverse consequences, including the collagen breakdown, the lack of good collagen formation, the immunosuppression, and the DNA mutations that lead to all the downstream consequences we want to prevent with sun protection. So how do the two sunscreens work? Let's take the physical sunscreen first. The physical sunscreens, zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, are particles. They are not absorbed into the skin. When you apply them, they sit on top of the skin, getting in perhaps a little bit to the stratum corneum, but primarily sitting on top of the skin. They work to reflect, to scatter, and to a lesser extent to absorb the ultraviolet rays, preventing them from passing into the deeper portions of the skin. One source that I read noted that when the energy is absorbed into the particles, since the particles are coated, they are not as prone to breaking down when the ultraviolet ray hits them. So I find them a little more trustworthy. Of the two filters, zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, I'm a zinc oxide fan. I prefer zinc oxide formulations. If there's some titanium dioxide in there, okay, but I prefer zinc oxide as my physical sunscreen agent. Organic UV filters, on the other hand, are capable, for the most part, of penetrating the skin. They can be found in the urine and in mother's milk, some of them, not all of them, but some of them can. And they, for the most part, block ultraviolet rays from entering your skin by absorption, meaning the UV ray hits, the energy of the UV ray is absorbed into the molecule that then blocks the ray from penetrating down deeper. I'm not a big fan of that. And some of the organic filters do that to greater extent and some do it to lesser extent. And I'm going to tell you about a few of them that I am a fan of. But for the most part, many of them I'm not. In addition, reasons I'm cautious with the organic filters is many of them are known allergens to the skin, causing rashes. Some are known photoallergens, meaning the light hits the organic filter and creates an allergen, which then gives you a rash and or stinging. And they're also tricky to formulate. So they may have a predictable protective wavelength that they cover individually, but you start mixing them together in a formulation and the game's entirely changes. It requires really clever formulation chemists to make a good organic sunscreen. And then photostability. They tend not to be as photostable as the physical sunscreens. The exceptions to the organic sunscreens are the Mixoral products, SX and XL. These organic filters are large. They're greater than the 500 Dalton rule. So things over 500 Daltons, that's sort of a measurement of size. So these are more blob-like. They're molecules that are too big to pass readily into the skin. So that gets a thumbs up from me. They block both UVA and UVB. They're photostable, so they don't break down when the light hits them readily. And they're a good choice when you need to go all the way through UVA1 because you're prone to hyperpigmentation, for example, in melasma. They are new, and one of them does come from a family of chemicals that has known ability to disrupt hormones, but they're not supposed to penetrate the skin. So the science is still evolving, but if you want to use a chemical sunscreen, one of the Mixorals would be fine, in my opinion. The other chemical sunscreens that are new and trending are the Tinosorb products. There's Tinosorb B and Tinosorb M. Again, these are large molecules, again, exceeding the 500 Dalton rule, so big blobs that don't penetrate readily into the skin. They too are photostable, so they don't break down when the sun hits them or when the ultraviolet hits them. And they too block both UVB and UVA. What am I doing right now for my own sun protection, and what am I recommending for my patients? Well, I'm still recommending the micro-sized or microfine coated zinc oxide as a main ingredient in sunscreen. I like to see at least 5% or more zinc oxide to beef up UVB protection, for example. Okay, so long as they're not allergens. The more chemical filters in a product, the more you have to follow the reapplication rule because they're not as photostable as the physical filters like zinc oxide. I'm also okay with Tinosorb and Mixoral products, and I'm sort of watching. I recommend that my patients follow the reapplication rule. Sunscreen is supposed to be reapplied after rubbing off, after you've been in water, and every 2 hours. And most importantly, I'm recommending my patients cover as much of their skin as possible with sun protective clothing, because then it's simple. You know you've got a good shield on to protect yourself from the ultraviolet radiation, and you have a smaller amount of surface area that you have to keep up with the every 2 hour reapplication rule. So my preference is wearing a good sun protective garment, and that doesn't mean a regular cotton t-shirt because they're not adequate or predictable with sun protection. You want a UPF 50 garment, and you want to cover as much of you as you comfortably can. You want to seek the shade, but remember, a lot of the ultraviolet rays bounce and come and get you, so they're going to enter your shade. So you need to be covering all exposed skin with sunscreen. And create shade by wearing a sun hat. You also need to put enough sunscreen on. We're supposed to apply an ounce of sunscreen to the average adult body surface area in a swimming suit. Most people put on a quarter of that to 3/4 of that. We know they're getting about 20 to 50% of the SPF that we are listing on the bottle of the sunscreen. So you want to make sure you're putting on enough and that you're reapplying. And then most importantly, watch your skin and learn. If you're getting a tan line, if your freckles are darkening, and heaven forbid if you got a sunburn, you need to modify your sun protective techniques, because that's information that is telling you the ultraviolet light got into your skin is trying to protect itself by making a tan or darkening freckles, and you're beginning to accumulate the DNA mutations, the immunosuppression, and the collagen degradation that is the adverse consequences of ultraviolet radiation. I did tell you that I'm a fan of sun protective clothing, micronized or microfine coated zinc oxide, and that the new Mexoryl and Tenosor products are interesting and definitely on my radar. So I hope that helped. If you liked the video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and please subscribe and keep up with what I'm doing, and if you know someone that might find this information interesting, please share. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.